I need to preface this by saying I mean maps in the most literal sense. I don't mean level design, I mean map. I mean cartographer map. I mean pirate ship X marks the spot, thar she blows map. The thing that you look at and go, here I am, and this is where I will go. Okay, with that out of the way. I play a lot of video games. I play a lot of video games with an emphasis on exploring, and I love when you have the option to explore in a video game with little to no hand-holding. You know what I'm talking about, the proverbial enormous flashing arrow that draws the line to exactly where you need to go. BioShock Infinite-itis. For some games, a more detailed map makes sense. For games as giant as a Skyrim or Dragon Age Inquisition or something, games where you're roving over vast tracts of land requiring sophisticated cartography, it's helpful to have a wider series of labels and symbols to help you sort through so many hundreds of thousands of digital square feet. But for a lot of more contained experiences, I don't think that all of these sleek, simplified, here's a key for all the symbols flashiness is necessary. I've realized over the years that many of the games with maps that I love for their style, thoughtful detail, or relative lack of labeling get absolutely torched for being bad, or hard to understand, or impractical. Today I wanted to cover a few notable cases and argue why I think these maps are good, actually. Hyperlight Drifter. The indie darling by the massively talented Heart Machine. I am so excited for Hyperlight Breaker right now, do not get me started. With a vaporwavy color palette and a gorgeous soundtrack by Disasterpiece and all the smooth slashing enemy variety and very difficult challenges you could want, should you so choose. The game has a stunningly simplistic map. In addition to the relatively simple art style of the whole game, it echoes the sort of retro, futuristic, technological wasteland vibe you get from wandering the overworld map-free. It feels like a welcome companion to the player character. It's something that'll get the job done, but you've been around the block enough to know you don't need all the bells and whistles, just the facts, please. You get this lovely, simple depiction of the overworld in a place called the Land of Light. Isn't that cute? I'm sure this game doesn't have any dark and personal themes in it at all. There are some pretty universal symbols here, with the warp pads/elevators marked with these little diamonds that are echoed by their design and world, and area bosses marked in these horrifying red pixel skulls that gray out as you defeat them. Then, for the series of underground areas located throughout the map, you have an alternative style, with sharp hot pink and red lines, and again, the markings you see up above. Like the whole game, the map is a little mysterious and clunky at first, but not without the detail and intrigue you find spread all throughout. You really feel like written language isn't at all necessary for an experience like this, and through a novel technique called good game design, you're able to pick up on enough story elements to start to untangle the mystery of why there are so many hostiles trying to go for your sweet cape whenever you leave the calm central town. I've seen a lot of mods and maps that mark where all the stuff is, all the gear bits and keys and the helpful items for your journey, and I think it really detracts from the whole experience. It's like if you went hiking with a friend and they drew lines for your trek all over your map, but then you were still stuck using the same map for all of your subsequent hikes. There's something so satisfying about seeing a mysterious marking and unveiling a whole little nook that you had to pass through some trees or a building to find. It really helps you feel like you're drifting, through this world on your mysterious quest to find something. No spoils, this is all about the maps here. I would highly encourage you to just happily wander, rather than using something like this, at least on a first playthrough. Many of the most fun moments I had playing on my first go-around were born of little surprise finds or almost breaking my controller, chain dashing a bajillion times, listening to the same Wecky Mecky song over and over and over again to try to keep the beat for the dashing until I felt like my heart was beating to the exact timing of the button mashing and my eyes were getting so dry but I had to blink but I couldn't crash into the wall. I was so close to find out that at least I got a sick new cape at the end of it all. Totally worth it. You say the map's overly simplistic, I say it's appropriately labeled. You mark the subway stations, not the newspapers that people left on the benches in them. I also have to admit I like using this example because the latest Heart Machine release, Solar Ash, actually commits what I think is one of the worst navigational atrocities in gaming, which is the point that shows up on the map in-game when pinged, which shows the distance from that point method. This is a good idea when you're moving on a relatively flat plane, but this game has plenty of verticality and plenty of traversing near spherical surfaces. This means you'll end up trying to minimize the distance and end up zipping around in circles around the sphere, never getting any closer than a certain point, which is still very far away, and you can't figure it out, and eventually you have to cave and find a walkthrough, because it seems navigably impossible to get to that spot. Anyway, moving on.
You gave us the permission and your regulations. We wait in the stains.
For this section, I'm going to be using the official Control art book. I highly recommend picking this up if you like this game at all. Without even opening it, it already looks like the classiest coffee table book of all time. Plus, it has all sorts of lore, detailed interviews with the creators, all kinds of concept art, and look at these trees. Look at them. They're lovely. Control is such a unique experience. It really subverts a lot of expectations when you are given a gun and then it turns into a different gun. And also you can fly, and coworkers are floating motionless until they fling toward you at the speed of sound, or they just keep darting around, and I swear I'm better at video games than this. Why is this happening? It's like they say, baby, 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 yeah, orange peel. I love The Oldest House. I would argue it's the true main character of the game because I'm pretentious like that. You come to learn that the house itself, the home of the Federal Bureau of Control, is prone to building shifts. In fact, when you first enter the building as Jesse right at the start of the game, you experience one such shift in a moment that I find a lot of people actually miss. If you try to head back to where you came in, you'll find that the layout of the hallway has changed. Ooh, are you giving me a building with brutalist architecture with shifting rooms and generically labeled pretzels right now? I am in for this one for the long haul. Anyway, what you see of these building shifts is primarily the aftermath, although you do fairly routinely get to see a few giant concrete blocks maneuvering about the space when you unlock control points as you travel through. Some posters on the wall switch around from time to time too, and the whole area where you start playing basically disappears forever once you take the elevator for the first time, at least insofar as it becomes inaccessible. You almost don't need to, because so many areas throughout the Oldest House are well labeled with cool signage, but if you open up the map, yeah, so, a little complicated. But rather than bemoan the weirdly convoluted outlines of every corner of every room in the Oldest House with shading that indicates something you're sure, but you're not sure what, I think this should be praised as a great reflection of Jessie's experience. She's just had this enormous responsibility set on her out of what is seemingly the clear blue sky, and has to learn how to navigate this winding, warping beast of a building to try to get some semblance of control. There it is. Haha. The mental toll of experiencing all of these new bizarre elements in the form of AWEs and OOPs and seeing hiss everywhere, knowing you have to get to dead letters for some reason, but what does that even mean, dead letters, is perfectly reflected in what I would argue is the deliberately challenging and obtuse design of the map. Put yourself in this scenario for a second. Are you going to stumble around with your nose pressed into an area-by-area directory of the Oldest House, or are you going to wander because things around you keep catching your eye? Perhaps the map itself is deliberately inaccessible to encourage exploration using environmental cues and interesting set decoration. Could it once again be the use of the novel technique of game design? Think of what you would do if your friend came to visit and asked for directions to walk from point A to point B. You might say, walk for about 2 minutes until you pass a yellow building on your left, then turn right. Or maybe, walk for about 1/10 of a mile, then turn right at the intersection. Or you might even just give them the address. Or say, go to the yellow building, then look for the green one and go there. Or say, you know Cynthia's house? Yeah, it's about a 3-minute walk down the street from there. I find that when I'm in areas where I grew up and spent a lot of time being a pretentious little kid getting driven around hither and yon, even if I'm driving, I go mostly by landmarks. Sure, I know some of the names of the roads around me, but I'm mostly going to go based on buildings and stuff that I recognize and knowing overall how long it feels like it should take to get from point A to point B. When I'm in a totally new place, I'll listen to GPS directions on my phone so I don't have to experience the shame of actually asking another person for directions, and then I'll confidently wander in whichever direction my virtual assistant is telling me to, and the whole thing will probably be very inefficient overall. Speaking of GPS, many languages make use of egocentric directions, that is to say, at the intersection, turn left, versus absolute directions, at the intersection, turn east. You've likely noticed if you're doing the whole walking GPS phone thing that you need to have that phone be facing the correct way, or your right isn't the phone's right, and then you're just walking in exactly the wrong direction, right? One notable exception to the egocentric directionality in languages is an ancestral language of Northern Australia from which we've learned the word kangaroo, and apologies in advance, kuku imitir, and now I'm going to say GY instead most of the time. Fun fact, there's a popular urban legend about how when Captain Cook and his party went ashore in northern Australia and saw a bunch of fuzzy jumping things they'd never seen before and asked what they were, a local replied, kangaroo, only for Cook and his team to find out later that the local was actually saying, I don't know, oh ha ha ha, oh how droll. Sorry to shatter the mystique, but this is pretty apocryphal. Even if one of my favorite sci-fi movies ever, Arrival, told the story like it was fact, I'd like to think that Louise was being tongue-in-cheek. In the mid to late 20th century, American anthropologist John B. Haviland wrote a series of papers on the GY language. Of particular note was how the language relied heavily on cardinal directions rather than something like using your left and my right and my left and your right as a frame of reference, which is common in many other languages. Cardinal directions are used to indicate points of space, with the classic direction words north, south, east, and west in English. In a paper published in the journal Ethos in March 1998, Haviland wrote, Speakers of the Australian language, Kuku Imitir, make heavy use in discourse about position and motion of inflected forms of four cardinal direction routes, similar in meaning to north, south, east, and west. The system of cardinal directions appears to involve principles for calculating horizontal position and motion strikingly different from familiar systems based on the anatomies of reference objects, including the speakers and hearers themselves. Rather than calculating location relative to inherent asymmetries in local reference objects, or from the viewpoint of observers themselves characterized by such asymmetries, the GY system apparently takes as its primitives global geocentric coordinates, seemingly independent of specific local terrain and based instead on horizontal angles which are fixed by the Earth and perhaps the Sun, and not subject to the rotation of observers or reference objects. So basically, the language isn't egocentric, womp womp, your relative rights and lefts are no good here. Haviland continues, GY selects for special elaboration both morphological and discursive, 4 roots for geocentric direction. The roots denote roughly the same directions as the English words north, south, east, and west, although the GY terms assume quadrants, rather than idealized points on the horizon. Basically, imagine a circle with 4 wedges cut out, and 1 wedge is devoted to each of the 4 roots. Haviland continues, the directions can be used to help reconstruct the geography of other spaces, just as the deictic here of here and now is typically transposable onto a different there and then, the east and west of the place where interlocutors sit must often be transposed to another place, suggesting that the cardinal point terms can be abstracted from particular terrain, that they are conceived as remaining constant across territories. This is the only sense in which the system of GY cardinal directions is absolute. It assumes that the directions remain the same over wide, possibly discontinuous expanses of real country. In other words, native speakers of the GY language likely have fantastic senses of cardinal direction compared to most speakers of languages that make heavy use of egocentric directional terms like English and many other European languages. So it might be a bit of a lift to pick this one up if you're looking to learn, but hey, at least you know one word already. Anyway, please read this journal article if this interests you at all. I hardly broached the surface and didn't want to embarrass myself trying to pronounce some of the direction roots. It is called Kuku Imitir Cardinal Directions by John B. Haviland and, like I said, was published in Ethos. There's also another detailed article on this topic by Stephen Levinson in the Journal of Linguistic Anthropology called Language and Cognition, The Cognitive Consequences of Spatial Description in Kuku Imitir. Anyway, try to put yourselves in the shoes of someone who uses absolute direction to, well, give directions. When a standard, for lack of a better word, global frame of reference is always top of mind in your speech, you can likely provide faster and more geographically helpful directions. You might even think that map use might be easier, especially because most maps have a compass. Oh damn it, neither of the maps I've mentioned has a compass. As the original author of the hit webcomic Craig the Reaper, if you know you know, I absolutely must bring up the Mass Effect Galaxy map design here. I could potentially see how one could argue it's difficult to use, and will therefore attempt some form of critique. If you're exploring in Mass Effect and just trying to extract every single speck of resources from the galaxy, and reading about Antibar and visiting Antibar and leaving Antibar after you visit, you might realize it's kind of hard to remember where Antibar was should you want to go back and visit again later without looking it up somewhere separately. This is predominantly due to the zoom-in, zoom-out structure of the galaxy map. When you first fire it up, I am firing up the remaster, by the way. You've got the Milky Way, our milkiest way, divided into a series of sections like galactic burrows, the terminus systems in the Attican Traverse, and so on. Then if you go to one of those burrows, I'm calling them burrows now, you've got the clusters within it shown, and then if you pick a cluster, then you've got the planets within the cluster shown, etc., etc. You could argue that it's a nicely broken up structure with this map, because it'd be way too much to sift through at once, especially when most of the clusters have 4 or 5 planets apiece, and the sweeping majority of planets in the game are just glorified flavor text anyway. It also helps better reflect the enormity of the galaxy as far as I'm concerned. In-universe, the massed relays are basically the gateway to humanity's ability to experience other species from all across space. Consequently, using one should feel like you're going really fucking far. I don't think I have a good counter-argument for this one. It's a good map. For those who want to slowly whoosh around and listen to one of the best pieces of music in the whole series, it can be very calming to effectively wander around a gallery of planets and pick up some extra bits, give you some extra resources. For those who just want to get to the good stuff, the game has the richness to back up its world building, but it's not getting in the way of quick progress. Plus, why the hell would you want to go back to Antibar? Zipping around on here made me wonder how the real science people do it, so I checked out galaxy maps on the NASA website, and look at this, they're marking the arms here. Each arm of the Milky Way, well, I assume that's the intent eventually, has its own little identifying name. This is like multiplying the Burrows thing from Mass Effect by 3 or 4 at least in terms of complexity, and like 6 times in terms of thoughtfulness and clever intent. Look at the Hubble sky map. Look at how many dots that is. Imagine zooming in on an arm of the Milky Way and seeing this. Finding what you needed would be like digging for a grain of sand in a bucket of other similar grains of sand that was spinning on a lazy Susan. I can appreciate how this would instantly quash any hopes of accessibility for gaming, but then again, look at No Man's Sky. Anyway. Bugs are great. Hollow Knight has bugs, ergo Hollow Knight is great. Hollow Knight, in addition to such elements as has bugs and is great, is a Metroidvania in which you can traverse a wide world battling bugs and meeting other bugs and buying things. The mood is up to here. The character design is robust and varied, but still recognizable enough to be characteristically insectoid. The music is poignant. Christopher Larkin is an incredible talent and runs the compositional gamut to create a wide variety of distinct moods and instantly classic melodies throughout the game. With Silksong hype already at dangerous levels, I will not persuade you further with boss fights or lore or anything. I'm not even going to begin to discuss the gameplay beyond how it directly pertains to using the map, except when I forget that I said that I wouldn't do that. Also, let me preface by saying you don't actually have to buy maps at all. If you really want to play the determined little guy with nothing to lose in the big bad world, you can easily avoid buying the map and quill altogether, along with other typically useful items such as light, so that you are able to see when there is no light, and stations for fast travel so that you don't die and spend an hour and a half working your way back across the entire world. You can stumble around largely blind until you eventually stumble into the right place, or fall into some spikes, get mad, and go see Cornifer and buy a map. I've put a lot of hours into Hollow Knight, and I do buy maps every time. Every time I play, however, I always buy the map, but not the Wayward Compass. The innate artistry of the map and level design makes it very easy to orient myself in any chamber because of a thing called good game design. You can very easily, provided you don't get murked by aspids, navigate to the borders of any chamber you're in, and then use the edges to determine where in the map you are. Isn't that neat? I love playing that way. It makes me feel like I'm scheming instead of reading instructions. Like I'm dumb for getting murked by aspids, but smart for figuring out which room I got murked by aspids in. Alternatively, if you're used to having a little icon go beep, here you are, whenever you open up your map, without needing to waste some time hunting around for the contours of the room, there's another equally feasible option. You can pick up the aforementioned Wayward Compass for a small fee, and it plinks your little player character icon down in the map wherever you are. This is a nice benefit if you're working on something like building up to a 112% run, or improving your times for speed running, or something like that. It also helps if this is your first time playing a game like this, as without it, staring at the map, especially as it gets more detailed, can quickly become overwhelming. Hollow Knight gives players a wide berth in determining how deliberately difficult they'd like their journey to be, and for that it has my full praise. So, Hollow Knight isn't good actually, it's just good. Many video games don't even need maps. Whether it's because of their linearity, simplicity, or simply their gameplay loop, a map just isn't necessary or helpful in many cases. However, when developers do bother to include one, rather than swiftly criticizing it for a lack of clarity or apparent over-complexity, perhaps consider why it looks and behaves the way it does. After all, an effective map may help you feel like you're carving your own path on a treacherous subterranean adventure, echo the protagonist's own navigational difficulties, or enrich the scale of the world. Thanks for watching.